The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, thick with the weight of justice being decided. People murmured quietly, shifting in their seats as they waited for the judge to arrive. But then, the heavy double doors swung open, and the silence was shattered by the sharp, authoritative voice of a police officer cutting through the air like a knife. "You. Stand up. Hands where I can see them." For a moment, there was confusion. A woman, seated near the front, blinked, looking around to see who he was talking to. Then, she felt it, the eyes. Everyone was looking at her. Her chest tightened. There was a beat of hesitation before she slowly placed her hands on the table in front of her, confused but calm. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice measured but firm. "I don't know what," did I stutter. The officer's tone was sharp, condescending. His heavy boots thudded against the floor as he moved toward her, towering over her, hand already on the cuffs at his belt. "Get up. Now." She didn't move. Her pulse pounded against her skin, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not the person you're looking for." But he didn't hear her. Or maybe he just didn't care. Rough fingers seized her wrist, yanking her to her feet so forcefully that her chair screeched against the floor and toppled backward with a loud crash. Gasps filled the room, but no one moved to stop him. No one spoke up. "What the hell are you doing?" she snapped, twisting in his grip, but he was already spinning her around, locking her arms behind her back. Cold metal clamped around her wrists, tight. Too tight. "This is an outrage." A voice finally cut through the tension, someone from across the room. But the officer ignored it. He pushed her forward, making her stumble. "You people always got an excuse," he muttered under his breath, low enough that only she could hear. "Always playing the victim, always causing trouble." Her breath caught in her throat. Her stomach churned, a sick mix of fury and disbelief twisting inside her. The heat of humiliation crawled up her neck. The people in the courtroom, some shocked, some entertained, some indifferent, watched as he marched her toward the exit like she was some criminal being dragged to her fate. She wanted to scream, to fight, to demand that someone, anyone, step in. But what good would that do? He had already made up his mind about her. He had already decided who she was. Then, suddenly, a voice rang out. "Officer Whitaker. Stop." Everything froze. The officer, halfway to the exit, turned sharply. A younger officer stood in the doorway, panting, gripping a stack of papers in his hand. His face was pale, his eyes darting between them in panic. "What?" The officer holding her was visibly irritated, his fingers still gripping her arm like a vice. The younger officer swallowed hard, then spoke the words that sent a ripple through the room. "She's not a suspect. Let her go. Right now." The silence was deafening. The officer's grip faltered for the briefest moment, his jaw tightening. "What the hell are you talking about?" he growled. The younger officer hesitated, then stepped forward, shoving the paperwork toward him. "She's not just an innocent bystander," he said, voice low but firm. She's the new chief of police." The air in the room seemed to shift, charged with something electric. The officer's hand clenched around the paper as his eyes flickered to her, something unreadable flashing across his face. The cuffs were still locked around her wrists. The humiliation, the injustice, the raw anger in her chest still burned. But now, a new emotion stirred beneath it, something cold and sharp. Vengeance. Because she saw it in his eyes, the realization, the slow dawning horror of who she really was. And she knew, in that moment, that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. What happened next would shock everyone. Before we begin, we want to take a moment to say this loud and clear: Plow of Twist stands against all forms of racism and discrimination. This story is a powerful reminder of the injustice that still exists and the strength it takes to overcome it. To everyone watching, especially our black audience, we see you, we stand with you, and your voice matters. This is more than just a story, it's a message. Now, get ready for a gripping tale of justice, karma, and an unforgettable twist. Make sure to subscribe to Plow of Twist so you never miss a powerful story like this. Enjoy the ride. The sun hung low over the city skyline, casting a golden haze over the courthouse. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and stale coffee, the quiet murmurs of legal assistants rustling through papers mixing with the occasional sharp clack of a gavel in a nearby courtroom. It was a place of order, of justice, or at least, that was what it was supposed to be. But for Nia Carter, justice had always been a battle, a war she had fought since the day she realized that being right didn't always mean being heard. She had grown up in Chicago, the daughter of a fiercely determined single mother who had taught her that survival wasn't enough, she had to excel, to outshine, to be undeniable. She had spent her childhood watching her mother navigate a world that refused to make space for her, absorbing every lesson, every warning. Nia had taken those lessons and turned them into armor, building herself into a woman who took up space whether people liked it or not. She had graduated top of her class at Howard University, then pushed her way into law enforcement, refusing to let the statistics or the doubters tell her otherwise. She climbed the ranks with a precision that left no room for error, no excuse for failure. She didn't just want to change the system. She wanted to own it. That morning, she had walked into the courthouse with a purpose, dressed in a crisp navy blue blazer, her natural curls framing her face like a crown. She was there for business, not theatrics. In just a few minutes, she was supposed to step into a meeting that would confirm what she had worked her entire life for, her appointment as chief of police. The weight of that moment sat in her chest, a slow, steady burn of anticipation mixed with the quiet, bitter acknowledgement that there were people who wouldn't be happy about it. Men like Officer Brad Whitaker. Brad Whitaker was everything Nia had spent her career trying to dismantle. A cop with power and a god complex. He had been on the force for years, long enough to learn exactly how much he could get away with. His record was blemished but untouchable, filled with complaints that had never gone anywhere, accusations brushed aside with well-practiced excuses. Excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics, he had mastered them all under the guise of just doing his job. And the worst part? The system protected him. Officers like Whitaker didn't get punished, they got promoted. That morning, Brad had walked into the courthouse with his usual smug confidence, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. To him, this was just another day, another chance to remind people who held the real power. When he saw Nia sitting near the front of the courtroom, he didn't see a woman waiting for a legal proceeding to start. He didn't see an equal. He saw a black woman in a space he didn't think she belonged. And that was all it took. Brad had always trusted his instincts, but the truth was, his instincts were poisoned by prejudice disguised as experience. He had spent years patrolling the streets, making snap judgments, deciding who was guilty before they even opened their mouths. And in his mind, a black woman sitting confidently in a courtroom, dressed sharply, unbothered, that was an anomaly. That was a threat. So, when he got the call to escort a suspect into custody, he didn't second-guess himself. He saw Nia and made his decision. The fact that she looked nothing like the suspect on file didn't matter. The fact that she hadn't even been inside the courthouse for more than 10 minutes didn't matter. The only thing that mattered to Brad Whitaker was that he had the power to act. What followed happened fast. One moment, Nia was reviewing her notes, focused on the meeting ahead. The next, she was being yanked to her feet by a man who had already decided she was guilty of something. His grip was firm, deliberate, the kind of grip that made it clear he wasn't just following orders, he was enjoying this. People stared. Some in shock, some in amusement. No one moved. No one spoke. Because this was not unusual. A black person being manhandled by the police. A misunderstanding that somehow always seemed to escalate when the person being detained had dark skin. It was just another Tuesday in America. Nia felt the cold metal of the cuffs snap around her wrists. Too tight. Always too tight. A sharp pain shot up her arm, but she bit down on the frustration bubbling in her chest. She had been in worse situations. She had faced worse men. But what infuriated her wasn't just the pain, or the humiliation, or the fact that this man had laid hands on her without even asking for her name. It was the certainty in his eyes. The complete and utter belief that he was right. And for a split second, she let herself wonder, if she had been anyone else, if she had been less educated, less composed, less connected, would she have even made it out of this courthouse alive? Then the voice came. Officer Whitaker. Let her go. The grip on her arm faltered. The certainty in his eyes flickered, just for a second. Then, as the words sank in, his entire face shifted, confusion first, then disbelief, then something else. Something dangerously close to fear. The younger officer, still breathless from running down the hallway, handed over the paperwork. His voice shook, not with nerves, but with the weight of what he was about to say. She's not the suspect. He swallowed hard. She's the new chief of police. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nia could feel it in the way the room seemed to shrink, in the way people stiffened in their seats, in the way Brad's fingers tensed and then quickly released her wrist, as if he had been burned. The metal cuffs still encircled her wrists, but now, they weren't just restraints. They were proof. Proof of who he was. Proof of what he had done. And in that moment, standing there, her breath coming in controlled, measured exhales, Nia realized something. She wasn't just going to walk away from this. She wasn't just going to let him apologize, or brush it off, or chalk it up to a misunderstanding. No. She was going to make him pay. The air in the courthouse felt different now. Heavy. Charged. The weight of what had just happened sat thick in the room, pressing against every person who had witnessed it. Officer Brad Whitaker's hand still hovered near the cuffs on his belt, his jaw tight, his face frozen in an expression that could only be described as controlled panic. His entire body language had shifted, from the smug certainty of a man convinced of his own righteousness to the rigid unease of someone realizing he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Nia Carter could feel the imprint of the metal cuffs on her wrists, the sting of where they had dug into her skin. She didn't rub at them. She didn't move at all. She just stood there, letting the moment breathe, letting the silence settle around them like a thick fog. The room had gone still, the collective gaze of every single person locked onto her, onto him, onto the absurdity of what had just unfolded. It was a moment that should have been impossible, and yet, here they were. The young officer who had rushed in to stop it all still stood frozen at the door, his eyes darting between them, unsure if he should say something more or simply disappear. The paperwork in his hands trembled slightly, the weight of his own words still sinking in. New Chief of Police. That title meant everything and nothing in the same breath. It meant power, but power didn't mean much if it still couldn't stop a man like Whitaker from treating her like she was less than human. Whitaker's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and strained, barely above a breath. This was a mistake. A mistake. The word hit the air like a feeble attempt to erase everything that had just happened, as if all it took was saying it out loud for the cuffs to have never been locked, for the humiliation to have never burned through her skin. A mistake. Nia let the word settle, her expression unreadable, but inside, something sharpened. A mistake. That was the excuse, the lifeline, the cop-out men like him always had. A mistake was something small, something forgivable, something that didn't require consequences. Her voice was quiet, but razor-sharp. A mistake. Whitaker swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as his posture stiffened. He glanced around the room, as if suddenly aware of just how many people had watched this unfold. He was a man who had spent years believing that his authority was unquestionable, that his actions were justified simply because he was the one making them. But now, for the first time, he looked unsure. "Chief Carter, she raised a hand. Not aggressively, not in anger, just enough. Enough to remind him that she was in control now. Enough to remind everyone in that room that things had shifted. "You put me in cuffs," she said, her voice steady. "In front of an entire courtroom. Without asking for my name. Without verifying anything. Without hesitation." Whitaker opened his mouth, then closed it. His hands twitched at his sides, his weight shifting from foot to foot. "It wasn't personal," he said, his voice tighter this time. "I was given orders to detain a suspect, and you saw a black woman sitting in a courtroom and made an assumption," she cut in, not letting him hide behind weak excuses. "Let's call it what it is." A beat of silence stretched between them. The judge had long since left, as had many of the onlookers who had been too uncomfortable to stay. But the people who remained, some attorneys, a few officers, court clerks, they weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. "I should have handled it differently," Whitaker said after a moment, his voice clipped, controlled, as if forcing himself to acknowledge something he still didn't truly believe. Nia tilted her head, studying him. "You don't get it, do you?" He didn't answer. "You were so sure," she said, voice quiet but laced with something undeniable. "So sure you were right. So sure you knew who I was before I even opened my mouth. That's the problem, Officer Whitaker. That's always been the problem." Whitaker's nostrils flared, his eyes darkening as his fingers twitched again. He was uncomfortable now. Good. He should be. "This is my city," she continued, stepping closer, forcing him to see her, to really see her. "And I'm going to make sure this department stops protecting people like you." His breath hitched slightly. Just a flicker of something behind his eyes, but she caught it. That fear, that sudden realization that whatever shield he had always counted on, it was cracking. "I'll do better," he said suddenly, almost too quickly. I'll make sure nothing like this happens again." Nia gave him a long, measured look. Then she smiled. Not a kind smile. Not a forgiving one. A knowing one. "You're right about one thing," she said smoothly. "Nothing like this will happen again. Because after today, everything is going to change." She turned to the young officer who had stopped this mess before it spiraled even further. His name tag read Martinez. "Walk with me," she said, and without waiting for a response, she strode toward the exit, leaving Whitaker standing there, fists clenched at his sides. As soon as they were outside the courtroom doors, Martinez exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "Chief Carter, you did the right thing," she interrupted, glancing at him. Not everyone in that room would have spoken up. Martinez shifted on his feet, clearly debating something. Then, after a pause, he said, "Whitaker. He's not going to let this go." Nia arched a brow. "No, he's not." Martinez hesitated again. Then, lower this time, like he wasn't sure he should be saying it out loud, he added, "He's dangerous, Chief." Nia didn't blink. Didn't flinch. She already knew that. "Let him try," she said simply, before walking away. And she meant it. Because if Brad Whitaker thought he was untouchable before, if he thought he could walk all over people like her and never answer for it, he was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. The game wasn't over. It was just getting started. The air inside the precinct was thick, heavier than usual. Conversations were quieter, eyes darted cautiously, and an unspoken tension lingered in the hallways. People had heard what happened. They knew Officer Brad Whitaker had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But they also knew men like him never truly faced consequences. That was about to change. Nia Carter stepped into her office, closing the door behind her. She didn't need to look to know that people were watching, whispering. She had spent her entire career being watched, by those waiting for her to fail, by those convinced she didn't belong, by those who didn't believe she could hold power without being a threat to them. She took a slow breath, rolling her shoulders back. Every move she made had to be calculated. The rage that simmered beneath her skin had to be controlled. She had learned a long time ago that black women didn't get the luxury of losing their temper. Not in rooms like these. Not when the people waiting to see her slip were the same ones who had spent their entire careers making sure people like her never made it this far. Her phone buzzed. Martinez. "Chief, you need to see this," he said the second she picked up. "It's about Whitaker." She already knew whatever it was bad. "Where?" "Interrogation room 2. She didn't ask why he was there. She didn't ask how bad it was. She just moved, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her pulse steady. The entire precinct felt different now, like something was shifting, something big, something irreversible. When she pushed open the door to the interrogation room, she found Martinez standing near the wall, arms crossed tightly, his face a mask of unease. But her attention locked onto the man sitting in the chair across from him. Brad Whitaker. But not the Brad Whitaker she was used to seeing. He wasn't standing tall, chest puffed out with arrogance. He wasn't throwing around his authority like a weapon. He was sitting, his hands flat against the steel table, his mouth pressed into a thin line, his entire body rigid with something between fury and disbelief. The power dynamic had shifted. And he knew it. Nia took her time crossing the room, pulling out the chair across from him, setting her hands on the table. She didn't speak right away. She let the silence settle. Let it press against him the way the weight of his decisions were finally pressing back. Whitaker exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You think this means something?" Nia arched a brow. "I'm sorry, did I miss the part where you're the one asking questions here?" His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists against the table. He hated this. He hated being the one on this side of the table. Hated not being in control. "I don't know what kind of stunt you're trying to pull," he muttered, his voice low, like he was still trying to cling to some ounce of authority, some last shred of power that was slipping through his fingers. "But this is bullshit, and you know it." Nia let out a quiet chuckle. "Bullshit?" she repeated, tilting her head. "You mean like arresting an innocent person without cause? Like throwing handcuffs on someone before even verifying who they are?" She leaned forward slightly, her voice smooth but dangerous. "Tell me, Whitaker, do you always call it bullshit when it happens to you?" His nostrils flared. He knew exactly what she was doing. Martinez cleared his throat, stepping forward. "We received a formal complaint against Officer Whitaker," he said, his voice measured. "One that came with evidence." Whitaker scoffed. "From who?" "Some thug trying to save their own ass." Nia tapped a file on the table, sliding it toward him. His name was all over it. And so were the details of what he had done. Excessive force. Harassment. Targeting people based on race. Covering for other officers who did the same. It was all there, not just accusations, but evidence. Surveillance footage. Body cam footage. Witness statements. And the worst part? Some of it had come from inside the department. Nia saw it the moment the realization hit him. The shift in his face. The flicker of panic before he masked it with rage. "This is a fucking setup," he growled. "No, Whitaker," Nia said, her voice smooth as glass. "This is accountability." He shot up from his chair, but she didn't flinch. She didn't move. She just stared at him, unshaken. He exhaled hard, shaking his head. "You don't belong here," he spat. "You think you can come in here, change everything, tear down everything this department is built on, you mean the corruption?" she interrupted smoothly. His fists clenched. His face darkened. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low, threatening. "You don't want to do this." Nia smiled. "Oh, but I do," she said softly. And then, before he could react, she slid another paper across the table. His termination notice. Effective immediately. Whitaker stared at it. Stared at her. Then he laughed, not out of amusement, but out of sheer disbelief. "You really think you can do this?" he murmured, his voice dangerously low. "You think you can take me down?" Nia leaned in, just slightly, her voice as cold as steel. "I already did." The door swung open, and 2 officers stepped inside. Not his friends. Not his allies. They weren't there to cover for him this time. They were there to escort him out. His breath came faster now, his fingers twitching. For the first time in his life, Brad Whitaker wasn't the one with the power. Nia stood slowly, smoothing out her blazer, her voice soft but final. "You were right about one thing," she said. "Nothing like this will happen again." And as Whitaker was led out of the room, the eyes of the entire precinct following him, Nia Carter knew, this wasn't just about him. This was just the beginning. The weight of the moment settled in the room like a storm that had finally broken. The energy in the precinct had shifted, the air thick with something no one dared name aloud. Nia Carter stood motionless as Whitaker was led out, his every step echoing off the walls, his shoulders squared, but his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were turning white. He refused to look back, but she could feel the rage rolling off of him in waves. No man like Whitaker ever truly believed he could lose. As soon as he disappeared down the hallway, murmurs erupted throughout the station. Some officers exchanged looks, whispers barely concealed. Others stood stiffly, pretending to be focused on paperwork, pretending this moment wasn't seismic. A few, however, had expressions Nia recognized all too well: resentment, defiance, the simmering hostility of those who believed she had overstepped. She let them stare. Let them watch. Let them understand that she wasn't going anywhere. Martinez shifted beside her, his arms still crossed tightly. He let out a slow breath, barely above a whisper. "He's not going to let this go." Nia didn't take her eyes off the hall where Whitaker had disappeared. "I know. Chief." Martinez hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "I mean it. He's dangerous. Guys like him have been running this department for decades," Nia interrupted, her voice even, but edged with something razor-sharp. "But not anymore." Martinez exhaled through his nose, glancing toward the other officers, then lowering his voice. "There are people in this precinct who still have his back. I expect nothing less." Martinez rubbed a hand over his jaw tightening. I know you want justice. But you need to watch your back, Chief. This isn't over." Nia turned to him then, studying the concern in his eyes. She respected it. Respected that he had the courage to say it aloud. But fear wasn't something she could afford right now. "It is for him," she said, her voice steady. Martinez didn't look convinced. Before either of them could say another word, the door swung open again. One of the department's senior officers, Lieutenant Harper, stepped inside. He was older, his salt and pepper hair cropped close, his uniform pristine. He had been with the force long before Nia had ever stepped foot in it. And she knew, just by the look on his face, that this conversation wasn't going to be friendly. "Chief Carter," Harper started, his tone clipped. "A word." Nia didn't move. "We can talk here." Harper's jaw tensed, but he nodded toward the hallway. "Outside. Now." Martinez shot her a look, but she gave him a small nod before stepping out with Harper, letting the door close behind them. The hallway was quieter, but the tension was suffocating. Harper turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Nia arched a brow. "Excuse me. You just put one of our own in cuffs." His voice was low, controlled, but laced with something dangerous. Do you have any idea how bad this looks? Nia let out a small, humorless chuckle. Oh, I think I have a pretty good idea. But please, enlighten me, what exactly do you think looks bad? Holding an officer accountable for assaulting his own chief of police in a courthouse. Exposing a man who's been abusing his badge for years. Because I've got news for you, Lieutenant, that's what looks bad. Harper took a step closer, his voice dropping even lower. You're making enemies. Good. This department has always handled things internally. You should have come to me first. Nia narrowed her eyes. Is that how it's been handled? Internally. Is that why Whitaker has a stack of complaints against him with nothing to show for it? Harper's expression didn't change. You think you're cleaning house, but all you're doing is putting a target on your back. The people here, they don't trust you yet. And a move like this? It's not going to help. Trust? Nia repeated, incredulous. You want me to earn their trust? You think I need the approval of men who let Whitaker run unchecked for years? Who covered for him? Who turned a blind eye every time he put his hands on someone who looked like me? She let out a breath, shaking her head. I didn't come here to be liked, Harper. I came here to fix a broken system. And if that makes me enemies, so be it. Harper's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, there was silence. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. You don't know what you just started, he muttered. Nia took a step closer, staring him down, unwavering. Then I guess we'll find out. Harper held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. You're going to regret this. And with that, he turned and walked away. Nia watched him go, feeling the weight of what she had just done settle into her bones. Martinez stepped out of the room behind her, looking between her and Harper's retreating figure. That go well? Better than expected. Martinez gave her a dry look. That bad, huh? She didn't answer. Because this wasn't over. Because Harper was right about one thing, she had started something today. But regret? She didn't have time for regret. The storm that had been brewing inside the precinct wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning to crack open, revealing the rot beneath the surface. Nia Carter felt it in the weight of the glances thrown her way, in the way conversations hushed when she walked past, in the silent resistance that came not in open defiance, but in the quiet undercurrents of a system that did not like to be challenged. Whitaker was gone. His badge had been stripped, his name now tangled in the kind of controversy that even the people who once protected him couldn't ignore. But power, especially the kind of power that men like Whitaker held for years, didn't just disappear overnight. Nia knew that the moment he walked out those doors, the real fight had begun. Inside her office, she stood near the window, staring out at the city beyond. The weight of the day pressed against her chest, but she refused to let it sink in just yet. There was still work to do. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Come in, Martinez. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him, his expression tense but measured. He had been quiet after everything, standing on the sidelines, watching as the pieces fell into place. But now, the worry that had been flickering in his eyes all day had settled into something heavier. You need to see this, he said, handing her a folder. She took it, flipping it open. The moment she saw what was inside, a slow, deep exhale left her lips. Whitaker had friends. Friends in the Union, friends in places that still clung to the old way of doing things, friends who were already moving to frame this entire thing as an attack on good officers, spinning the narrative into one where Nia wasn't a leader demanding accountability, she was a problem that needed to be removed. Martinez watched her closely. They're trying to get you out, Chief. Of course, they were. She shut the folder with a calmness that didn't quite reach the simmering rage beneath her skin. How bad is it? They're pushing for an internal review of your actions, trying to paint this as a personal vendetta. They're calling in favors, twisting the story. And Whitaker? He's playing into it. Nia's grip on the folder tightened slightly. He's not just walking away, Chief, Martinez continued. He wants payback. And he's got people who still think he deserves to be in that uniform. Nia wasn't surprised. Men like Whitaker never believed they were the problem. They saw accountability as an attack, justice as a betrayal, consequences as oppression. She set the folder down, finally turning to face Martinez fully. And where do you stand? The question wasn't an accusation. It was a test. Martinez met her gaze without hesitation. With you. Nia studied him for a moment, then nodded once. Good. A beat of silence stretched between them before Martinez exhaled, running a hand over his face. Chief, this is going to get ugly. She knew that. She had known that the second she put those papers in front of Whitaker. I didn't come here expecting it to be easy, Martinez. Yeah, well, easy would have been nice, he muttered, before shaking his head. Look, I need to know you're ready for what's coming. Nia didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, there was no being ready for something like this. She had spent her entire career preparing for battles like these, but nothing ever truly prepared you for the moment the battle began. Still, she met his gaze and said, with certainty, I'm not backing down. Martinez let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. I figured you'd say that. She smirked, just a little. You wouldn't respect me if I didn't. He didn't deny it. Another knock at the door interrupted them. This time, it was a younger officer, one of the few Nia had seen in the precinct who hadn't looked at her with suspicion. He hesitated before stepping in. Chief, there's someone here to see you. Nia frowned slightly. Who? The officer hesitated again before finally saying the name. Brad Whitaker. The room seemed to still. Martinez stiffened immediately. You've got to be kidding me. Nia's expression didn't change, but she felt something tighten in her chest. He's waiting outside, the officer added cautiously. There was no reason for Whitaker to be back here. No reason except to make a statement. Martinez looked at her. You want me to send him away? Nia thought for a moment, then shook her head. No. Let him in. Martinez's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he moved toward the door, nodding for the officer to bring him in. Moments later, Brad Whitaker stepped back into the precinct, and for the first time in his life, he was the outsider here. He wasn't wearing his uniform. No badge. No gun. Just a man who had spent his life believing he was untouchable, now standing in front of the very woman who had shattered that illusion. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Whitaker let out a slow breath and shook his head. You must be feeling real proud of yourself. Nia didn't blink. I don't feel anything. Whitaker scoffed. Bullshit. She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, controlled. Is that why you're here? To convince me this was personal? He held her gaze, something dark flashing behind his eyes. It was personal. Nia exhaled through her nose, stepping closer. You made it personal the second you put those cuffs on me. His jaw flexed. I made a mistake. Nia let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. No, Whitaker. You made a choice. And for the first time in your life, you had to face the consequences of it. Whitaker's hands twitched at his sides. You think this is over? She smiled, but it wasn't friendly. I know it's not. He studied her, then shook his head, a slow, bitter smirk tugging at his lips. You don't belong here. Her expression didn't change. And yet, here I am. A beat of silence. Then, finally, Whitaker exhaled sharply and stepped back. "You're gonna regret this." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. But Nia? She wasn't scared of men like him anymore. She had already won. The atmosphere in the precinct was thick with unspoken tension, an invisible force that clung to the walls, making the air heavier with every passing second. There was a shift happening, one that had started the moment Brad Whitaker had been taken down, but it hadn't ended there. No, the storm was still building, gathering strength beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break loose. Nia Carter could feel it in the way the officers around her moved, in the way some avoided her gaze entirely, while others let their resentment linger in the air like cigarette smoke. These men had spent years under a system that protected people like Whitaker, and now, for the first time, they were forced to confront the ugly truth, that the badge didn't make them invincible. That power unchecked could crumble. And Nia Carter was the one holding the hammer. But power shifts never came without consequence. Inside her office, the walls felt tighter than usual, the space both a sanctuary and a battlefield. She stood near the window, her hands resting lightly on the desk, but her mind was racing, dissecting every possible move, every angle, every potential backlash. This wasn't just about one man. It never had been. Whitaker was just a symptom of a disease that ran much deeper, one that had poisoned the foundation of the department for decades. Her phone buzzed against the desk. A sharp, vibrating sound that broke through her thoughts. She reached for it without hesitation, already knowing who it was. Martinez. "Chief," his voice came through the receiver, low, urgent. "We have a problem." Nia's grip on the phone tightened slightly, though her voice remained steady. "How bad?" "Bad enough that you need to see it for yourself," Martinez said. "Meet me in the conference room." She didn't hesitate. By the time she arrived, the room was already filled with tension. Martinez stood near the table, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression unreadable, but his eyes told the real story. He wasn't just concerned, he was pissed. Laid out on the table was a folder, its contents spread across the surface in a way that told her this wasn't just paperwork, this was a war plan. She reached for the first sheet of paper, scanning it quickly. The words practically jumped off the page. "Internal review," she murmured, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. Martinez nodded grimly. "They're moving fast, Chief. Whitaker might be out, but he's not out of the fight. He's playing this like a martyr, spinning it like you came after him for personal reasons." Nia exhaled slowly, flipping to the next page. "And people are buying it." Martinez's jaw tightened. "More than a few. He still has allies, and they're pushing hard to get you investigated. If they can make this look like a personal vendetta instead of a justified action, they might have enough leverage to force you out." The weight of the words pressed against her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had expected this. The moment Whitaker had walked out those doors, she knew he wouldn't stay quiet. He was a man who had spent his entire career dodging accountability, and now that it had caught up to him, he was doing what men like him always did, twisting the narrative. "They want to turn me into the villain," she said finally, setting the papers down. "Yeah," Martinez said. "And they're not wasting any time." A bitter smile ghosted across Nia's lips. "Of course they're not. If they can't control me, the next best thing is to destroy me." Martinez didn't argue. He just nodded. For a long moment, silence settled between them. The weight of everything sat thick in the air, but Nia refused to let it drag her down. "They think I'm scared," she said finally, her voice quiet, but strong, unshaken. Martinez tilted his head slightly, watching her. "Are you?" She met his gaze, something sharp flickering behind her eyes. "No. But they should be." Before Martinez could respond, the door to the conference room swung open. An officer, young, nervous, shifting uncomfortably as he stood in the doorway. "Chief, there's someone here to see you." Nia frowned slightly, already sensing where this was going. Who? The officer hesitated, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. Brad Whitaker. The air in the room stilled. Martinez stiffened immediately, his entire body going rigid. Tell me you're joking. The young officer just shook his head. He's outside. Says he wants to talk. Martinez let out a sharp breath, already moving toward the door. No. Absolutely not. He's not setting foot in this, let him in, Nia interrupted, her voice steady. Martinez snapped his head toward her, his expression sharp. Chief, I said let him in, she repeated, meeting his gaze. There was a beat of hesitation, a moment where Martinez looked like he wanted to argue. But he didn't. He just exhaled sharply and nodded. The next few seconds stretched out in an eerie silence as the door opened again, and then, there he was. Brad Whitaker. No badge. No gun. No uniform to shield him. Just a man who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, now forced to stand in front of the very woman who had dismantled that illusion. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Whitaker let out a slow, quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You must be feeling real proud of yourself. Nia didn't blink. I don't feel anything. Bullshit, Whitaker muttered, his voice bitter. You wanted this. You wanted to take me down. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. No, Whitaker. You took yourself down. His jaw clenched, his fists twitching at his sides. This isn't over. She exhaled slowly, stepping forward. No, it's not. But not in the way you think. His brows furrowed. What the hell does that mean? Nia smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It means you don't scare me. It means your time in this department is over, and there's nothing you can do about it. Whitaker took a slow step back, his expression shifting. For the first time, there was something else in his eyes, something uncertain. You don't belong here, he muttered, shaking his head. She took another step closer. And yet, here I am. Another silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating. Then, finally, Whitaker exhaled sharply, shaking his head again. You're gonna regret this. His voice was low, almost a whisper now. But Nia? She wasn't scared of men like him anymore. She had already won. The atmosphere in the room had shifted into something almost suffocating, pressing in from all sides, as if the very walls themselves had shrunk inward, trapping the energy between them. The precinct, once a place where Brad Whitaker had walked with unchecked confidence, was no longer the fortress he had always believed it to be. It wasn't his sanctuary anymore. It wasn't his to control. And yet, he stood there, as if the weight of his years of dominance could still mean something, as if his mere presence could change the course of what had already been set into motion. Nia Carter didn't move. She didn't blink. She barely even breathed as she watched him, her gaze steady, unwavering, unreadable. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, no smugness in her stance. But there was certainty, the kind that Whitaker couldn't shake, no matter how much he tried. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched, in the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides, in the way his breathing was just slightly uneven, despite his best efforts to mask it. He had spent his entire career making people afraid of him, but now, for the first time, he was the one standing on unstable ground. He exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders back, trying to reclaim some of the authority that had already slipped through his fingers. His voice, when he finally spoke, was laced with bitterness, low and controlled, but weighed down by something else. Something heavier than just anger. You think this means something? His eyes narrowed slightly, searching her face for a crack, for a reaction, for anything that would let him believe he still had an ounce of control in this situation. You think getting rid of me changes anything? Nia tilted her head slightly, considering him, letting his words settle into the thick silence between them before she responded. Her voice was smooth, even, but firm in a way that made it clear she wasn't here to entertain his delusions. You tell me, Whitaker. Does it feel like nothing's changed? His nostrils flared slightly, his jaw tightening even further, but he said nothing. You want me gone? Fine, he muttered after a beat, his voice lower now, almost a growl. You made your move. But you think you've won? You think the people in this department are just going to fall in line for you? He let out a dry, humorless chuckle, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? The second you walked into this place, you were the outsider. They don't trust you. They never will. Nia let the words hang between them, let them settle in the air like a challenge. He was trying to make her doubt herself. Trying to plant a seed of uncertainty, to make her feel as if she was standing on borrowed time. But he didn't realize that she had already considered all of this, that she had walked into this role knowing exactly what she was up against. She took a slow step forward, just enough to close the space between them, just enough to make sure that every word she spoke landed exactly where it needed to. Trust isn't what keeps this place running, Whitaker. Fear is. The fear of stepping out of line, of going against the status quo, of challenging people like you. That's the real power here. And you? You were the enforcer of that fear. But not anymore. Whitaker's fingers twitched at his sides, and for a brief second, something flickered behind his eyes. Something almost uncertain. You think they're afraid of you? His voice was tight, like he was forcing the words out. No, Nia said simply, shaking her head. But they're afraid of what I represent. And that's enough. He didn't respond right away. He just stared at her, his breathing uneven now, his chest rising and falling just a little too fast, just a little too controlled. He knew. He knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. He wasn't just another cop who had overstepped, he was a symbol of a system that was starting to crack. You don't belong here, he finally muttered, shaking his head, as if saying it aloud would somehow make it true. Nia took another slow step forward, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the thick air between them. And yet, here I am. A heavy silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, neither one looking away, neither one breaking. Then, finally, Whitaker let out a slow breath, shaking his head once more, his mouth twisting into something that almost looked like a smirk, but lacked the confidence it once held. You're gonna regret this, he muttered, but the words came out less like a warning and more like a last-ditch attempt to hold on to something that was already gone. Nia didn't flinch. Didn't hesitate. Didn't let an ounce of doubt creep into her expression. Instead, she let the smallest smile ghost across her lips, but it was cold. Sharp. Dangerous. No, Whitaker, she said, her voice steady. You will. Behind them, the door creaked open, and Martinez stepped inside, his presence an unspoken signal that this conversation was over. Whitaker's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something else, but then, he didn't. Because there was nothing left to say. He knew he had lost. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his footsteps slow, deliberate, but lacking the confidence they once held. The door shut behind him, the sound final, like the closing of a chapter that should have ended long ago. Martinez let out a sharp breath, rubbing a hand over his face. That was a mistake. Nia arched a brow. Letting him in or letting him leave? Martinez hesitated for a second, then sighed, shaking his head. Both. She exhaled through her nose, turning her gaze toward the now empty doorway. He's not done. We both know that. Martinez nodded grimly, his arms crossing tightly over his chest. Yeah. And that's what worries me. Nia didn't answer. Because she knew. Men like Whitaker never let go quietly. And this wasn't over. Not yet. The days that followed Whitaker's departure were filled with a tension that clung to the precinct like smoke after a fire. His absence wasn't the kind that faded into the background, it was the kind that left an emptiness people didn't know how to fill. There were those who still whispered his name, those who spoke of him in hushed tones as if he had been wronged, as if he had been a casualty instead of a consequence. But there were others, officers who had spent years biting their tongues, watching men like him operate unchecked, powerless to do anything about it, who walked a little taller now, who held their heads a little higher. They didn't say it out loud, not yet, but Nia could see it in their eyes. The walls of the precinct had shifted. The system had been shaken. And whether people liked it or not, change had already begun. But change wasn't always a celebration. Change was resistance, a battle that didn't end with one man being removed. Whitaker had been a symptom, not the disease itself. And Nia knew that just because the storm had passed didn't mean the damage had been undone. She spent her days restructuring, making moves too deliberate for anyone to question but bold enough to be felt. She reassigned officers who had been protected for too long, transferred those who thought their connections would keep them safe, and brought in new blood, people who had been waiting for the chance to serve without fear of the old regime. But even as she worked, even as she put everything in place, she knew there was still one loose end. Whitaker had disappeared from the department, but he hadn't disappeared entirely. Men like him didn't just fade away. They lingered, clinging to whatever power they had left, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. And he had tried. First, there were the anonymous complaints, attempts to smear Nia's name, to turn her into the problem instead of the solution. Then came the rumors, the quiet conversations in back rooms, the former allies of his trying to push back, to make her position unstable. But they failed. Because she had expected every single move, anticipated every single attack, and countered them before they could even take root. And then, finally, Whitaker tried to come back. It wasn't in a grand, dramatic fashion. He didn't barge in demanding his job back. No, his desperation was quieter than that, more pathetic. He showed up at a public event, a charity fundraiser hosted by the city, where members of law enforcement and politicians all mingled under the guise of public service. He approached her not as the man who had once stood in front of her with unchecked arrogance, but as someone who had lost everything and didn't know what to do next. "You got what you wanted," he muttered, standing just close enough that only she could hear. "Is that enough for you?" She turned to face him, taking in the man who had once seen himself as untouchable. He didn't look like the Whitaker she had met that day in the courthouse. He looked smaller now, like a man who had finally realized the walls he had built around himself had crumbled, and he had no idea how to exist outside of them. "I wanted justice," she said simply. "Not revenge." He scoffed, shaking his head. "Same thing." She studied him, taking in the bitterness in his expression, the way he couldn't accept that this was the bed he had made for himself. "No, Whitaker. Revenge is what you wanted. I just did my job." His jaw clenched, but he had no comeback. Because deep down, he knew she was right. For a brief moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then she remembered what he had done, how many people he had hurt, how many lives he had ruined with his unchecked authority. And she realized something: Whitaker wasn't angry because he had been wronged. He was angry because, for the first time in his life, he was being held accountable. She turned away, leaving him standing there, letting the weight of his own downfall be the only thing left for him to hold on to. And as she walked away, she knew, this fight wasn't over. But she had already won the first battle. Because the foundation had cracked, and the system would never be the same again. And that's the thing about power. It's never truly about who holds it, it's about who is willing to challenge it. Nia Carter walked into a system that wasn't built for her, a world that never expected her to rise, and she did more than just survive it, she changed it. But justice isn't a moment. It's not a single victory. It's a war fought every single day, in rooms where people aren't listening, in spaces where the odds are already stacked against you. Brad Whitaker lost because he believed he was untouchable. He thought the rules would never apply to him. And in the end, that was his downfall, not Nia Carter, not the system, but his own arrogance. So, what do you think? Was justice served? Or was this just the beginning of something bigger? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it. And if you love stories that make you think, that make you feel, that challenge the way you see the world, make sure you subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because there's always another story waiting to be told.